Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. We live in a time of astounding scientific breakthroughs and unprecedented medical marvels, but modern man has yet not found a way to overcome the one thing that is inevitable to every person, regardless of their social status, income, or lifestyle: death. Let's talk about the inevitability of death with my dear friend Carl Olson, editor-in-chief of the Catholic World Report and Ignatius Insight, prolific author, and wearer of many hats. Carl, great to speak with you again. How are you?
Good. Thanks, Marcus. Always good to talk to you.
Likewise. And you and I actually did recently talk about the fact that man would want to overcome death if he could be his own God. And so let's talk about that. Let's begin by talking about how it's inevitable, and I think it's the source of secular man's greatest terror.
It is. I agree totally. I think that if you look at the dominant culture today, I think we could honestly say that so much of it, the majority of it, is spent trying to avoid dealing with or thinking about death. Now, that might sound a little bit odd because we have so many movies and TV shows and things that focus on shootouts and explosions and, great tragic events. But I think that also is another way of trying to grapple with the reality of death, specifically, my own death. And so we come up with these ways to distract us, oddly enough, sometimes by fixating on kind of dramatic forms of death, instead of the fact that most death is not that way, right? Most death is quiet. It at times can be horrific. I mean, there can be, obviously, people suffer from great diseases and so forth. But we don't, it reminds me, if you will, it reminds me of a great passage from Frank Sheed that he wrote back in the 1950s that I sometimes pull out to shock people a little bit, in which Sheed says, in the modern world, and again, he's writing this in the 1950s, people don't think about sex, he said.
Yeah.
They fixate on it, they have all these things about it, but they don't actually think about sex. And I think the same thing can be said about death. We don't actually think about it and the reality of it, and so we try to avoid it as best we can, which, it's not healthy, it's not good, it's not realistic.
I love that you use that phrase from Chesterton, because that analogously applies to death. We do everything we can to run away from it. We rage against the dying of the light here in the post-Christian
Right.
West, and yet we do everything we can to also make sure it's sanitized. Even in the face of someone dying, we act as if nothing bad really happened.
Yeah, and I think it's because, well, there are many factors here, obviously. I mean, I think there's so many different aspects of this. But one is that when you're around people who are dying, as many of us have been, we are reminded of our creatureliness. We're reminded of how fragile everything is, right? And of course, if you're not someone who believes in Jesus Christ, if you're not someone who believes there is a loving God who wishes to welcome us into eternal beatitude with him, what do you do? I mean, I think you probably have seen it just as I have, how people, this kind of a quiet form of insanity that you see with people as they approach the end. I unfortunately know of a couple instances of friends whose parents are not believers of any sort, who are in the midst of kind of dying, and they say that there's just kind of this madness. And only by dying in the embrace of the loving God can we, hope to make any sense of this, as difficult as it still would be. And so we live, with what John Paul II called the eschatological tension. We're made for something more, but we're here in this temporal realm, and there's only one way in which we can actually address or handle, if you will, face correctly, I guess, this great tension. And that's through, again, the grace and love and mercy of God.
The hilarious thing about thinking about this question, Carl, like you've rightly mentioned, is for the secular man who clamors so much to be his own God, he's never going to conquer death. And yet, in embracing the Lord of life, he gives us the way out of death.
Yeah, I think it speaks directly to the so many of the great paradoxes of the faith, right? Easter, when we get to Easter in a couple of weeks, like in the Eastern tradition, we sing this great hymn, by death he conquered death. There's this great paradox that it's only by going through death that death can be conquered. And of course, that's because of Christ being raised from the dead. And it speaks to the Trinitarian mission, the Trinitarian work of salvation, in which the Father sends the Son. So then the Son shows us the way to handle life and death, and that is through complete self-gift, complete love, which we see so strikingly, so radically on the cross. That's the only way through. And for a lot of people, that they don't they don't want to gaze upon the crucifix. I mean, I think if we're honest, we all have those moments where we don't want to do that, right? And that's why this time of the year is so important, so powerful, because it challenges us to do that, especially during Holy Week. It's the only way. It's the only way through. The only way to handle this. The fact that we are temporal, we're limited, and all of us will come to an end. We will in this realm.
Now, can you also address the fact that this temptation is not new? We've been doing this since the garden, and yet every time we attempt to create remedies for life by ourselves, we author our own demise.
Yeah, it goes back to that pride, the pride in the garden, right? When Adam, there's many aspects of the fall, and one of those, of course, is pride. One of those is a failure to love as well. And really, it's a way of, there's really, in my piece kind of hints at this with a great quote from Benedict XVI, where there's really only two choices when it comes to how are we going to transcend death, and that is, one, by making ourselves God, which ends in complete ruin, or in dying to ourselves and in dying in and through the person of Jesus Christ, we then arise victorious from that through his death and resurrection, of course, which is what animates all of that. Those are the only two ways. So man is perpetually, I think, tempted to try to divinize himself, when in fact God has said, I actually have come to divinize you, to fill you with my divine life, so that we might by grace become sons and daughters of God. Those are the two choices. That's it. I think people want to think there's some kind of infinite spectrum or so many other possibilities, but there aren't. At the end of the day, those are the two possibilities.
I'm talking with Carl Olson, editor-in-chief of Catholic World Report and Ignatius Insight. Now, we're rounding off this segment. Carl, we've got about just a minute and a half left in this segment. I want to invite you to really speak to every person listening right now, because it's a season of Lent, and one of the exhortations of the church is, in this season, embrace your death, which is such a disconcerting thing to say to someone, and yet it's a fundamental call of the Catholic life.
It is, and I think that's why Lent can be very, very difficult, because it forces us to face up to that. It's a call to, for me, I was just recently reading some of the passages where Christ talks about taking up your cross, embracing the cross. There's a Christianity out there, there's forms of it that want nothing to do with the cross, right? There's belief systems that run away from the cross. We're called to embrace it, because it's precisely through that authentic life, which we all want. Everyone wants authentic and full and lasting life, but the only way to achieve it, paradoxically again, is by placing ourselves on that cross through the power of God. He is the one who gives us the strength and the power to do that, and he is the one, of course, who saves us through his death and resurrection. So, again, that's it, and it's a hard thing sometimes to look at directly, and I think Lent is that challenge, to look at this reality directly.
I'm talking once again with Carl Olson, editor-in-chief of Catholic World Report and Ignatius Insight. And Carl's exhortation is, believe me, he and I will be the first to admit this, it is both profound and difficult, and yet that is the reason for the call of Lent. Embrace the reality that we will die, and then we shall truly begin to live. Continuing on the other side of the break, stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. I'm talking with my friend Carl Olson. He is the editor-in-chief of Catholic World Report and Ignatius Insight, prolific author, speaker, and thinker. And we're talking about the inevitability of death. Carl, I want to invite you to also speak to that issue that we are seeing in the post-Christian West of funerals being a quote-unquote celebration of life, which, as you've already mentioned, is yet another way that we try to sanitize and euphemize death.
Oh, it's in a way, it's a little bit funny you bring this up because my pastor, who's a wonderful priest, this is one of his pet peeves, and about once a year he'll do a homily where he talks about this, and it's almost kind of a boomer thing, right? I think his name is Joseph Quinn, who's a great secular comedian, wrote a book, and he had a great chapter in there on this, and he kind of mocks this. Actually, kind of surprisingly, he mocks this idea, and he notes that it's a failure to deal with mortality, that it's just almost a childish way of running away from this reality, right? And so we get to hear, and I've been at some of these, it's been a long time, but I remember a couple of times in my younger days going to a couple of these celebrations of life, and it's kind of a fascinating and revealing event, because people are clearly grieving, and yet they're trying to avoid the reality of what they're grieving about. I mean, that's kind of the strange thing. It's the heart of it. Whereas when you go to a proper funeral, a Catholic funeral, like I know I've been to many more in the Byzantine tradition because we've been in a Eastern Catholic parish for 25 years now, and I tell you, it's really profound because on the one hand, there's this theme, and of course, so much of it's drawn directly from Scripture, where it just says, you're dust, and to dust you shall return, and yet at the same time, it speaks to the glory that God has called us to, of the salvation that He has offered to us. And I think that's what a funeral should be. It should be a reckoning with who we are, and not about, gosh, this guy was great and this woman is wonderful. There's a time and place for that, obviously. There's a time and place for that. But at a funeral, we are really talking about what has happened, which is that person has died, and we commit their soul to the mercy of God. That's the bottom line. And so it's really about recognizing who we are before God. And I think that's what these celebrations of life refuse to do. They don't want to acknowledge who we are as creatures before God. Bottom line for me, that's my take on it. I think I think that's what people try to do. They don't want to admit or acknowledge that fact.
Why is that?
Because we are speaking for others, of course, only Marcus. No, but speaking for myself, of course, we're naturally rebellious. We're naturally frightened. We know in our heart of hearts what's coming. And it's not, again, people should know, we're not sitting here saying, gosh, we should just sit around, do nothing but fixate on the fact that we're going to die. No, I think the point here is that we live with the knowledge that death is inevitable, which means we are called to be and to live in a certain way. And that is with this vertical dimension, this relationship with the triune God that must be there. Otherwise, we go astray, and we end up, we look at the perversion of the world, and we talk, there's a lot of stuff, of course, we could say about the demise, like in the Western world, of so many things. But I think part of it is because as Christian culture has been eroded or even distorted, our view of death and our view of corruption and our view of this reality has become more and more twisted. And then people begin to act and live in a more twisted way. They begin to see this as more of a normal thing rather than that's not the way it is meant to be. We are called to live in a certain way, to be children of God, but that only comes about if we are in right relationship with the Father through the Son by the power of the Holy Spirit. That's the only way. So, we end up in a very distorted world, a world full of hollow men, to go back to the great poem by T.S. Eliot.
That, and that's the unfortunate reality, that the more we run away from God, the more we spiral ourselves in the very darkness that brings about our doom. I don't know if you've ever read the book Faust. I'm reminded of exactly that when man attempts to dabble with the divine without the divine, he gains nothing.
Yeah, it's a great way of putting it. To dabble with the divine without the divine, it's. I think it's so much of what we see with people who are floundering there because they know they are mortal. And if they don't look to God, they grasp at things in a way that ends up destroying them, breaking those things, destroying themselves, because they don't have the means, the tools by which to actually cope with this fact. If we don't have the means and the mentality and the correct perspective, we end up embracing ways of living and of relating and living with others that is ruinous, that harms us, harms others. We see it, I think, in so many aspects of, you look everything from homelessness to drug addiction to whatever. We can look at those dramatic examples, but also I think kind of the quiet despair and malaise that we see around us. Because people are like, what am I living for? What is the point? And the answers are not there in a way that they used to be, even if imperfectly, decades or centuries ago. And so people struggle mightily, I think.
If I may, this might be putting you on the spot a little because it's difficult to answer this, but I know you'll do it well. How much of this has been owed to the failure of us as Catholics, including in leadership, in putting forth these truths boldly and unabashedly in the midst of a dying culture?
I think it's huge. It's really funny you bring this up because just yesterday I was reading a passage in Christopher Dawson's book, Judgment of Nations, which I forget the date when that came out, but it's a good 80, 90 years ago. And Dawson says, in essence, he says, all these different problems we see in the West, and he's writing this again, I think in the 1930s perhaps, maybe the 40s, that so many of the problems we see in the West are because of Christians, because they have not lived the way that they're supposed to live, and that Christendom itself, I mean, he, of course, is writing probably in between the two world wars, there's been such a breakdown in culture and social cohesion and a spiritual vision. And yes, we as Catholics, we should acknowledge that this has been a failure. That we can point to specific leaders and leadership and whatever, and I think that's fair, done the right way. But we have to acknowledge that our witness, and I know I speak for myself, my witness is not as strong as it should be. That we do need to be more bold in proclaiming this because people are hungry for this. People are hungry for the truth. I mean, where else are they going to go? Thinking of Walker Percy, he did a self-interview. Why did you become Catholic? And he responds to himself by saying, well, what else is there? What else is there? And I've always loved that because he then goes through a list, secular humanism and Buddhism. And he says, it won't do. It's not good enough. Only the Catholic faith can answer these questions and provide the hope. And without that hope, how do we live? How shall we live without hope? I think it's the whole point of Benedict XVI's great encyclical Spe Salvi on hope, which unfortunately was kind of, I don't think enough people read it or contemplated it, but it's a great work, especially to read during this time of Lent and going towards Holy Week. That's a great encyclical to revisit.
Now, given that you just started talking about Holy Week, and, like you mentioned, we're just moving into Holy Week, now is as good a time as any to force ourselves into that headspace. What are some real ways we can say, okay, I tend to run away from death, the culture makes me do it, but for this week, I want to gear myself up to getting ready to think about death?
Well, I think there's different ways to do this, of course. One thing that happens, at least in the Byzantine church that we're in, is we end up on Good Friday morning, reading and listening to all four of the Passion accounts in their entirety. And I think this is something like, even going back to maybe one's personal, somebody could do this on their own, like say on the beginning of Holy Week, to read a Passion account from Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, and to contemplate it, to spend some time contemplating Christ, for example, Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, Christ before Pilate, the account of his crucifixion, just to read it, and I think to have it in your mind as you then attend the different liturgies and different services of Holy Week, to let it seep in, and to really, I think, focus on some of the details. I was really struck. I was rereading an account of in Matthew's Gospel about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, and when he's approached by Judas and the soldiers, he says to them, "Who are you looking for? Who are you looking for?" And I thought, that's a question that Jesus addresses to every single one of us, right? Who are we looking for? What are we looking for? And it's interesting how many times in the Gospels Christ asks a question like this of people, but those questions, first and foremost, are for them, but then they're directly for me. Like when Peter and the apostles are asked by Christ, "Who do men say that I am?" And then, "Who do you say that I am?" Well, is this not the question for all of us? Who do we say that Christ is? And then in the Garden of Gethsemane, "Who do you say that I am?" And of course, it's striking. It's in the Garden of Gethsemane because Christ is the new Adam. He's in the garden. And when mankind comes to him, he says to them, who are you looking for? And it says they turned away and they fell on their faces. And I'm just thinking, we are called to either turn away and fall on our faces, or we're called to look him in the face and to fall on our faces. Those are the choices we have.
Okay, that's a profound way to end. Carl, thank you very, very much for your time. My guest has been Carl Olson, editor-in-chief of Ignatius Insight and the Catholic World Report, and he and I have been talking about the inevitability of death. We are coming up on Holy Week. Now is the time to turn our faces toward the grave. I'm Marcus Peter.